and welcome to another episode of On the Fly. Really quite excited by today's guest. I'm joined by Neil Goodrich, Business Insight Manager of Orbit Group. Neil, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad, mate. Happy to be here. Really happy.
Good. I I appreciate that. Well, you are the first guest within a new season, as it were. We've been talking for a while, whether it's talking about the rugby, the sector as a whole, you name it, we've discussed it. And the kind of topic that seems to be coming up at the moment between what we talk around, as well as other people in the sector as well, is have housing associations lost their way a little bit about ultimately why they were set up? And I know this is a subject that you're quite opinionated on and got quite a lot of thoughts about. So I'll leave it to you then with that question. Where do we begin?
I think the answer is no, but yes.
Okay.
And it is a complex one. I think when you're talking about housing sector, we tend to get quite kind of a narrow view on who operates in there. But the reality is you've got circa 13 to 1400 private registered providers in England alone. So you have a very diverse number of organisations. And within there, you'll have different levels of opinion on exactly what housing organisations should be doing, where they should be focused on. The introduction post 2008 of for-profit providers into the sector has added another kind of layer of intrigue in there. So I think if you were to say, are housing associations the exact same beast that they were circa 1960s, when you had the real second wave, what we'd known as traditional housing associations turn up following Cathy come home, and that? Absolutely not. They are more professional, they are much broader in terms of their geographical spread, and they are much more complex in terms of their nature. Are they similar to the philanthropic era from the kind of late Victorian period? Absolutely not. These aren't just wealthy individuals circa Guinness or Peabody, or Octavia Hill setting things up and driving through their own cash. Again, completely different beast. Are they fundamentally trying to do the same thing, which is to provide housing for those most in need? Yes. Do they do lots of other activities that can lead to mission creep and a blurring of the lines and roles and responsibilities? Absolutely. I think one of the interesting things on the sector, and certainly one of the historic complaints when housing used to be solely owned by predominantly owned by local authorities, was a lack of accountability, transparency and responsibility. People were expected to be grateful just to have a roof over their heads. If you had an issue with your local housing team, well, tough, that's just how it is. Many of those complaints can be applied today, even though when you saw the breakup, particularly of the really large municipal housing providers, thinking here of Glasgow, thinking here of Birmingham, one of the core aims was actually to create more accountability, more transparency by having locally based, locally sourced organisations. So it gets to be a very complicated picture very quickly. My argument is, despite the nature of the beast these days, do you, at your heart as an organisation, this comes directly from the board through to senior leadership, right the way down to those on the ground floor, so to speak, do you have at your heart the desire to provide better housing situation for those by hook or crook who have not been able to access it? If that is a yes, then we can go out and have a pint and there's not going to be an issue.
Yeah.
If you want to work for a property developer, if you see that building new housing is your only raison d'etre and everything else is fluffy stuff that is superfluous to the central core of your organisation, then we have a problem. Housing associations aren't necessarily property developers. Many are. A larger number aren't. And it comes down to how the organisation and how those who ultimately steer the organisation see the role of a housing association. But for me, it's housing first, it's property development second, and all the other stuff after that. So it's an interesting picture, shall we say.
It is. And so, my background within recruitment, I lead for property and regen and development on the new build side of things across the UK for Green Acres. So I'm very much involved within that side of things. And I think the argument is that, funding, when it was more local authority based and the housing stock sat within councils, there was access to funds and that sort of arena. I say I'm not a professional or expert in that area, but that's what the general consensus is to layman's terms. I think now organisations have and it's an interesting one, because what I see is that absolutely they call it non-for-profits. I think that's a dead term in my opinion. I call it, a lot of people, I know, agree with this, they call it profit for purpose.
Yeah.
And a lot of businesses now use the likes of new build or other ventures, as it were, explicitly to pump the money back into the housing association for the greater good. But what I see, and what I think you'll agree with me here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's all very well about the profit being made to be pumped back into the business, but is it going a bit too far commercial? Is it going a bit too far down the line? I think, you know, the perfect vision of a housing association is having a housing officer working the beat, as it were. It knows everybody, but now have they become too big or too focused in other areas that they've lost ultimately what they were set up to do?
It's interesting. There's a fair amount to unpack in there. I think the first thing is cross subsidy is bollocks. It always was and always will be. To rely purely on a cross subsidy model is to be lying to yourself in terms of the reality of building. You're completely right in saying that historically there were much higher levels of grant. So back in the 70s, you could actually get 110% grant just because of the way that the things worked. These days, capital grant probably accounts for anywhere between 11 to 15% of the cost of a build on a development on average. So you are reliant heavily on leveraging in private finance in order to develop. This has implications on behaviour, focuses and business practices, because you need to assure those who are lending you not insignificant amount of funds that you can do your job effectively and efficiently. I think more broadly, there are issues morally with such an approach. Should you rely on profit from shared owners, who, let's not forget, are another marginalised group? The reason why shared ownership exists is because these people are excluded from traditional for sale products, and they are, I always refer to them, not unkindly, but as canaries in the gold mine, because, you know, when you start to see arrears or significant issues with that kind of demographic or part of your portfolio, you know other issues are going to flow through, because they are the ones who tend to be on more regular pay. They are, yes, they're above and beyond in terms of qualifying for what we'd have as social or affordable rent, but they are not in the best financial situation for various reasons in terms of home ownership. It's why they've gone through there. So to rely in part on your existence and your profits off the back of those, I think it is morally dubious and shouldn't be particularly allowed. But it is where we are as a sector. In terms of, you know, how wholesale we operate, I think it's very interesting. We are heavily influenced by national government policy. You only have to look at the way things have changed over the past decade, since coalition government in 2010 through to now, and what products are available. That is a direct result of central government diktat pushing things out. And you look at affordable rent, for example, as a classic one, and it always comes back to the same thing, which is, what does the money tell you to do? Capital funding will always come with strings attached, because we are normally independent organisations, not for profit, as you say, or as profit for purpose. We have certain covenants that we're expected to operate within, but we are still influenced by what the government of the day wants to do, because we are fundamentally providing a public good, albeit by a third-party actor. So we have this bizarre situation where we want to set ourselves as these individual dynamic organisations that want to generate our own income to be able to fully control our own destinies. But at best, we're operating, to borrow a phrase from an old colleague of mine, we have freedom within a framework. There are boundaries to where we can shift and where we can position how we do things, because ultimately, if you want to build more housing, you're always going to need to take the Queen's shilling. And as soon as you do that, there are roles and obligations that come with it, such as the affordable rent. In the new Affordable Homes Programme, it's going to be voluntary right to buy shared ownership, which has all sorts of side implications and was rightly dumped when Heseltine had it in his brief back in the 90s. So the fact that it's coming around again is just it's depressing. But it's an interesting one.
And I think everyone, you know, people ask me what I do for a living, and I say recruit into affordable housing, and then that itself brings up loads of images, stereotypes, that sort of thing, as you know. But you were mentioning it earlier, where does affordable housing or social housing sit, as it were? Because it's not private sector, but it's not also outright public sector either. It's just that, or not even third sector as a charity. It's a very grey area, isn't it? And depending on where you kind of place your flag, whether it is towards that private sector side of things, or like you say, taking the the royal shilling and taking those kind of grants with those rules, and it's like a pendulum, I guess, swinging between the two.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an odd one.
It's interesting. I think as a sector, we get hung up saying we're at a crossroads, and I think that's kind of the wrong analogy. Not least of which because it reminds me of a very, very bad British hip hop group from the early 2000s. But what we are actually on is on a continuum. On the one side, you have those who effectively want to be a really stripped back service provider, that basically a property management company. You have a broad portfolio with private rent, with affordable rent, with social rent, with for sale, and for shared ownership. That's who I want to be. You then on the other side have your real, hardcore is the wrong word because they're not being extreme or fundamentalist, but the position is community focused, not necessarily interested in development per se, but will look to acquire stock where possible within financial constraints. But it's all about that community focus. Social rent is your primary kind of model of housing to deliver, and actually quite happy having those intensive management approaches where you have 500 units per housing officer or less, as used to be de facto. And people tend to swing across the two, and they almost get this kind of split personality because they can see the advantage of entering into a more diverse market. It helps your portfolio to have income streams from different areas. And going back to the tie to public funds, a lot of our money comes from central government, either by central government in terms of grant for building, or via the DWP for rents being paid. Now, you can argue that relationship is direct to the individuals making the claim, but ultimately that money will come to us. So we're highly, highly susceptible to changes in government policy. So having demographics that sit outside that is potentially advantageous. But you have to understand, again, what your core values are. And if you're saying, well, it's fine to enter into these activities as long as they are an addition to and not the raison d'etre. And I think that's where a few kind of fall down. And you can see the real danger of it. Cosmopolitan are a perfect example. No longer exist. They are defunct as a housing association because they went big into student lets and got it wrong, spectacularly so, and ended up being taken over, I think, by Sanctuary in the end. If you look over in Holland with Vestia, you had an organisation that basically bet on the currency market and got it wrong. Now they have a slightly different regulatory setup, and for housing policy nerds, it's beautiful to read up on. But no one wants that again. No one wants to go double Dutch. So
they say, don't start Gabby on Dutch housing, otherwise Christ will be in for it. But I think you're right. And I guess a question for you then: where do you sit as the individual then? So you've got those more commercially minded people. You've got the community as the mindset, and you can see different housing associations align within that spectrum. Where would you see yourself? Neil Goodrich, where does he sit on that spectrum?
See, my heart is always on the community-based and community-focused one, and I'm a fierce advocate for an open and transparent way of operating as an organisation that is accountable to and beholden by ultimately our tenants, our customers. What I would say is you need to ensure that you acquire the ability to deliver efficiencies in how you do things, because let's not get lost in rose-tinted views of the past. Housing associations have been badly run. They are still badly run, and they were badly run in the past. It's not to say they weren't attempting to do the right thing, but just because you're trying to do the right thing doesn't mean you're doing it in the right way. I also believe that effectively what housing associations are SMEs, small to medium enterprises. So they don't always pick up on the best practice on how to do things. They don't always do things in the most effective way. And actually we can be quite insular in how we approach things. We share our homework. It's great. There are very few sectors anywhere in the world where you could phone up someone who is in effect your competitor and say, mate, how are you doing things? What's working for you? What isn't? It's why elements like the NHF, like the CIH, like the National Almo Federation, all of these great organisations that facilitate this cross-learning is fantastic. But world exists outside, And if Tesco's are able to do something well, we should be looking at how we can apply that to us in a generic sense. If Ocado, if Eon, Scottish Power, whatever, all these different ones have elements that we can take and improve our own business on. So just because ultimately I am a bit of a left winger in my thinking doesn't mean that you can't be progressive and forward thinking as an organisation, and ultimately have a diverse portfolio. I think absolutely you can, but you need to remember what you're here for ultimately, and I think some have forgotten that.
And I think there is a level of tribalism in housing, isn't there, between various housing associations, as in we're better than you, you're, type of thing. And I agree with it. And I think, I do a lot of work with the CIH, as you know, and I know that you're all about many different great, ideas that you've got, whether it's, bringing young talent through with CIH Futures and the work those guys did, which you were part of to begin with, and also then bringing, whether it's these online learning portals where people can jump in, chat, have converse. I know loads of different events have been set up. I do agree with that, and I think housing probably could learn more if they spoke to each other more. I think as well. I think I've had a couple of chief execs on here, and they've all said that sometimes it can be lonely at the top, and they actually thrive off being able to have the conversations with other fellow chief execs, sharing ideas, worries, concerns, where they think the market and the sector are going to go. So I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Appreciate it. I'll take my check after
this conversation. I'll slip you a 20 next time we get to go out. But obviously you're very prominent on Twitter. Where can people find you?
Yeah. Oh, good. I should know my handle. I think it's Goodrich HSG. Not to be mistaken with my little brother, who's I think Nick Goodrich as well. So
the Goodrich brothers are prime real estate in the housing sector. So but yeah, I'll direct people to your Twitter handle as well. And I think the beard seems to be growing every time I see you, Neil. To be fair, is this lockdown beard or?
Yeah, well, the taking the advantage of not having to worry about the personal appearance too much. This is probably only the second time I've worn a shirt in several months, but I appreciate just the opportunity not to shave, to be honest, because it's just a bit of a faff.
No, I agree with that. I don't suffer that, as I get regularly mentioned. I'm follically challenged up top, so all you need to do is just give yourself a bit of a quick brrr and you're sorted type of thing. But well, look, Neil, I really appreciate you coming on today, just to kind of talk things through. And I think it's a very interesting topic that hopefully will spark some debates on the various platforms we share it on. But look, take care, and we'll speak soon.
Happy days, mate. Look after yourself. Until the next time.
Take care.